The family gathering was as loud and chaotic as ever. Relatives crammed into the living room, some sitting on the couches, others milling about in the kitchen, while kids ran around, dodging their parents' calls to sit still. The familiar scent of roasted chicken and mashed potatoes wafted through the air. It was the kind of scene I'd grown accustomed to, filled with well-meaning relatives who never failed to poke fun at each other, and never held back on their unsolicited opinions about my life. I found myself nestled on the couch next to Ryan, who was awkwardly attempting to chat with my cousin Daniel about some business venture. It wasn't that Ryan wasn't capable of holding a conversation, but when it came to my family, he was always a bit of an outsider, trying too hard to fit in, to say the right thing. I had always been the more carefree one, but I had no idea how much of that carefree attitude would come back to bite me. Ryan, looking uncomfortable as usual, caught my eye, and I shot him a playful grin. "You're fortunate that my standards are low," I said, leaning in slightly toward him, but loud enough for the people around to hear. It was meant to be a joke, a throwaway remark, really. I was just poking fun at myself in front of my family. They'd always teased me about the kind of men I dated, the ones who didn't meet the usual high standards my mother would have liked. I had come to accept that, maybe, I was a little too easygoing in my choice of partners. Ryan froze for a second. The slight smile that had been on his face faltered, and I could see the wheels in his head turning. I didn't think much of it at first. In fact, I didn't even notice the discomfort in his expression until he went quiet. I reached for my glass of wine, wondering if I'd said something wrong, but dismissing the thought quickly. It was just a joke. He'd understand. My mother, who had been hovering nearby, caught the tail end of what I'd said, and her eyes narrowed. She always had a way of picking up on things I never even realized were important. "Don't say things like that, darling," she muttered under her breath, her voice surprisingly stern. I shot her a quick, dismissive look. "Mom, relax. It's just a joke." But she wasn't relaxed. She turned away, shaking her head with that familiar look of disappointment. "You should have higher standards, you know. You're young, you can still..." I didn't let her finish. "I said it's just a joke," I snapped, maybe a bit too harshly. My mother's judgment was something I'd never been able to escape, and on days like today, it stung a little more than usual. Ryan shifted beside me, his hand gripping the edge of the couch. "It's fine," he said, forcing a smile, but I could tell there was something off in his tone. I shot him a look, a bit more serious now. "Are you okay?" I asked, feeling the awkwardness between us settle into something more palpable. He nodded stiffly. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just a little surprised." I raised an eyebrow. "Surprised by what?" He swallowed, looking down at his lap, then back up at me. "I don't know. Just... I didn't know you thought of me like that. Like I was some... I don't know, convenient option for you." I blinked. "Ryan, what are you talking about?" He shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. "It's just that, you said your standards are low, and I don't know, it makes me feel like I'm not meeting some expectation, or that maybe I'm not what you really want." My heart sank, and I immediately felt a pang of guilt. "Ryan, no. That's not what I meant at all. You know that." But he didn't look convinced. He just nodded again, his jaw set tight. "Maybe I should have thought more about this. Maybe I'm not the right guy for you." I wanted to reach out to him, to reassure him, but the words felt like they were stuck somewhere deep inside me. The whole room felt suffocating, and the pressure from my family, their disapproving glances and comments, was beginning to weigh on me. My mother, still in the background, had been listening in, her arms crossed as if she had known this conversation would happen eventually. She was always so quick to judge, so sure that I deserved someone better, someone who met all the standards she had in mind for me. But her idea of better never seemed to align with the people I cared about. Ryan stood up suddenly, making me jump. "Maybe we should talk about this later," he muttered, his face a mixture of frustration and confusion. I wanted to apologize, to make everything better, but I was afraid that any attempt would just make things worse. I watched as he walked toward the door, pulling on his jacket without another word. The room seemed to spin for a moment, and I sat there, feeling like I'd just lost something, though I wasn't entirely sure what. The sound of my mother's voice broke through my thoughts. "You need to be more careful with what you say," she said, her tone low but cutting. I looked up at her, my frustration bubbling over. "I didn't think it would upset him, Mom. It was just a joke." "You never think," she replied sharply. "And that's your problem. You've never taken anything seriously enough. Not your relationships, not your life. It's why you keep making the same mistakes." I wanted to argue with her, to tell her that I didn't need her lectures, but instead, I just nodded, the words dying in my throat. I didn't know what to say anymore. As I sat there in the silence that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had said something that had shifted something irreparably between me and Ryan. My mind replayed the moment over and over, and I realized that my joke about my low standards might have just cost me the one person I truly cared about. It was a stupid remark, one that I had never thought would carry so much weight. And now, I was left to wonder if there was any way to undo the damage I had done. A week had passed since that fateful comment, and the tension in the air was thick, lingering like a bad smell that refused to leave. Ryan and I hadn't spoken much since the family gathering. He'd texted a couple of times, but the conversations were strained and awkward. I kept trying to dismiss the nagging feeling that something had gone terribly wrong, but deep down, I knew that I had crossed a line. I couldn't take back the words I'd said, no matter how much I wished I could. The moment I had dreaded came late one evening when Ryan called. I had been avoiding his calls, unsure of how to face him after everything. When I saw his name on the screen, my heart skipped a beat. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail, but my curiosity and anxiety won out. I pressed the answer button and put the phone to my ear. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual, even though my throat felt tight. There was a long pause before he spoke. "We need to talk." I felt a cold knot form in the pit of my stomach. "Okay," I whispered, almost afraid of what was coming. "Listen, I've been thinking about what you said," Ryan began, his voice low, almost hesitant. "And I've come to a conclusion." I held my breath, dreading his next words. The silence between us seemed to stretch on, unbearable and suffocating. "I think we should break up," he said, the words coming out in a rush, as though he had been rehearsing them for days. I felt like the ground beneath me had just been ripped away. My hand tightened around the phone, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. "What?" I whispered, disbelief creeping into my voice. "Ryan, wait, this doesn't make sense. You're overreacting. It was just a joke." "It didn't feel like a joke to me," he replied, his tone sharp now, a mixture of frustration and hurt. "You made it sound like I was the last option for you. That I wasn't good enough. And honestly, I don't know if I can get past that." The sting of his words hit me like a slap. I felt a rush of guilt and regret wash over me, but I couldn't find the right words to explain myself. "I didn't mean it like that," I said quickly, my voice cracking. "It was just a stupid thing to say. You know I didn't mean it. I don't think you're some last option. You mean something to me, Ryan. I'm sorry. Please don't let this be the reason we end things." There was a brief silence on the other end, and I could hear him breathing, as if he was wrestling with his own emotions. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Every time we're together, it feels like I'm not enough for you. I've been thinking about this a lot, and I don't think I can keep pretending that I don't feel like I'm constantly falling short. Maybe you were right all along. Maybe my standards weren't high enough for you." His words stabbed at me, and I could feel the tears starting to well up in my eyes. "Ryan, that's not what I meant. You're more than enough. Please, just listen to me," but he interrupted me, his voice firm. "I've listened. And I think we need some space. I can't keep putting myself through this." I swallowed hard, fighting the lump in my throat. "So, this is it? Just like that? We're done?" "It's for the best," he replied, his voice cold now, the warmth that had once been there completely gone. "I think we need to move on. I need to move on." The words were like a knife, and before I could say anything else, he hung up. The line went dead in my ear, and I was left in the silence of my own thoughts. I stared at the phone in my hand, as if expecting it to ring again, as if hoping that I could somehow undo what had just happened. But there was no magic reset button. It was over. I dropped the phone onto the couch beside me and buried my face in my hands. The weight of it all settled on my shoulders, crushing me. I had ruined everything with one careless remark. One joke had been enough to make Ryan walk away from me, and now, I had nothing left to hold on to. The sound of my mother's voice came from the hallway, pulling me out of my spiral of self-pity. "Who was that?" she asked, stepping into the room. I couldn't bring myself to look at her. "It was Ryan," I said quietly, my voice trembling. She didn't say anything at first, but I could feel her eyes on me, studying me, waiting for me to explain. "What happened?" she finally asked, her tone soft but laced with concern. He broke up with me," I whispered, the words tasting bitter on my tongue. Her expression softened, but there was no sympathy in her eyes. "I told you," she said quietly. "You need to be careful with your words. You push people away, and then you wonder why things don't work out." I wanted to argue, to tell her that she was wrong, that it was just a stupid mistake, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I sat there, silently, feeling the weight of her judgment settle over me. The silence between us was suffocating, and I could almost hear the unspoken criticism hanging in the air. "I didn't mean it," I whispered, more to myself than to her. "I didn't mean to push him away." But deep down, I knew that it was too late for apologies. I had already lost him, and nothing I said or did could change that. The damage was done, and now, I was the one left alone, picking up the pieces of a relationship I had carelessly destroyed. It's funny how time seems to stretch and contract in ways you never expect. The days since Ryan and I broke up felt both like a lifetime and like no time at all. At first, I kept telling myself that maybe he'd change his mind, that he'd call me and tell me this was all just a misunderstanding, that we could start over. But as the days turned into weeks, the silence between us grew thicker, heavier. The phone didn't ring. He didn't text. And I found myself waiting for something that would never come. I kept busy, throwing myself into work, hanging out with friends, even picking up hobbies I hadn't bothered with in years. I was trying to convince myself that I was okay, that I was fine being on my own, that this was all part of some bigger plan. But in the quiet moments, when I was alone with my thoughts, it hit me harder than I cared to admit. I missed him. More than I had ever expected. More than I was willing to admit, even to myself. The silence was suffocating. And it wasn't just Ryan. It was my family too. I had been avoiding them, not because I didn't love them, but because their disapproving looks were too much to handle. My mother, always the first to criticize, had been particularly quiet since the breakup. She never asked me how I was doing, never offered a word of comfort. I could feel the judgment in her silence, like she was waiting for me to admit that I had messed up, that I had somehow brought this on myself. But that wasn't how I felt. I didn't want to admit that my careless words had destroyed something that could have been good. But I also couldn't deny the truth, I had pushed Ryan away. It wasn't just the joke about my low standards. It was the way I had never taken anything seriously enough, the way I had always let my family's opinion shape my choices, the way I had ignored the little things that should have mattered. And yet, every time I thought about calling him, every time I wanted to reach out and fix everything, my pride stopped me. I was too proud to apologize, too proud to admit that I had been wrong. Instead, I wallowed in my own self-pity, watching the days slip away, knowing that I was the one who had let something good slip through my fingers. I was sitting in my apartment one Saturday afternoon, the sun streaming through the windows, when my phone finally buzzed. It was a text from him. "Can we talk?" I stared at the message for a few moments, my heart racing. Was this it? Was he finally ready to have that conversation I had been waiting for? I felt a mixture of hope and fear flood through me. I quickly typed out a response, trying to keep my cool. "Yeah." "When?" "Now?" "Sure." I couldn't believe it. It had been so long since we had spoken, since we had shared anything of real substance. I stood up and paced the room for a moment, trying to calm my nerves. What was I going to say? What if it was too late to fix things? What if he had moved on, and I was just fooling myself into thinking I could still make it right? A few minutes later, the doorbell rang, and my heart skipped a beat. I opened the door to find Ryan standing there, his face a mixture of uncertainty and determination. He looked different somehow, like he had changed in the weeks since we'd last seen each other. He was dressed casually, but there was a seriousness about him now, something I hadn't noticed before. It made my stomach twist in knots. "Hey," he said, his voice soft, almost hesitant. "Hey," I replied, trying to sound normal, though my heart was pounding in my chest. I stepped aside, motioning for him to come in. He walked in, his gaze flickering around the apartment before settling on me. There was a brief silence, and for a moment, neither of us knew what to say. The weight of everything unsaid hung in the air, thick and uncomfortable. "I've been thinking a lot," Ryan finally said, his voice breaking the silence. "About?" I asked, trying to keep my tone steady, but my nerves were betraying me. "About what you said," he began, his eyes meeting mine. "About how I wasn't what you really wanted. How I wasn't good enough." He paused, taking a deep breath. "I've been trying to figure out if I could just move past that, if I could still be the kind of guy you need." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Ryan, I never meant it like that. I swear. It was just a stupid joke. I never thought you weren't good enough. You've always been more than enough." He shook his head slightly, his eyes soft but distant. "But that's the thing. It's not just about the words you said. It's about how I've felt all along. Like I'm never really the one you want. Like I'm just convenient." I felt a sharp pang in my chest at his words. "No, that's not true," I said, my voice trembling now. "I've never wanted anyone else more than I wanted you. I messed up. I wasn't thinking, and I said something stupid. But that doesn't mean I don't care about you." Ryan took a step closer, his gaze searching mine. "But that's the problem," he said quietly. "You don't think. You let things slip, and then it's too late to fix them. I've been trying to make sense of all this, but I don't know if I can keep doing this. I don't know if I can keep waiting for you to see what's right in front of you. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to argue, to tell him that I could change, that I could be better, but I knew deep down that the damage had already been done. He wasn't angry, not in the way I had expected. He was just tired. I don't want to keep hurting you, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. But I don't want to lose you either. Ryan's eyes softened for a moment, but the resolve in his expression didn't waver. I don't know what to say, honestly, he replied. Maybe we both need some time to think about what we really want. I nodded, feeling the weight of his words settle over me like a thick fog. I understand, I whispered, feeling the tears prick at the corners of my eyes. Ryan turned to leave, his footsteps heavy on the floor as he headed toward the door. But before he stepped out, he paused and looked back at me. I'm not saying this is over, he said, his voice quiet but firm. But I need to know that you'll take this seriously. That you won't keep making the same mistakes. And then he was gone, leaving me standing in the empty apartment, with nothing but my thoughts and the crushing weight of the silence he had left behind. It had been 3 days since Ryan walked out of my apartment, and the silence was unbearable. I had spent those days in a fog, replaying everything over and over in my mind, wondering if I could have said something different, acted differently. My apartment felt too big, too empty, and every corner seemed to whisper reminders of what I had lost. I couldn't escape the nagging feeling that I had messed up so badly that there was no coming back from it. It was a Tuesday morning when my phone buzzed with an unexpected message. My heart leapt in my chest when I saw Ryan's name appear on the screen. I stared at the message for a moment, my mind racing. Was this it? Was he finally going to reach out to me? I opened the text with trembling hands. We need to talk. The words sent a chill through me. The last time we had talked, it had ended with him walking out of my life. But there was something different about this message, something that made me believe there might still be a chance. I quickly typed a response, my fingers moving faster than I could think. Where? Same place. I'll be there in 20 minutes. I stared at the message for a moment, the hope that had been buried deep inside me suddenly springing back to life. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my coat and rushed out the door, my mind spinning with possibilities. What if he had come to forgive me? What if we could start over, leave the past behind us? But then a darker thought crept in, what if this was the final goodbye, the closure I never thought I'd get? The idea made my chest tighten, but I pushed it aside. I had to believe in the possibility of reconciliation. I arrived at the cafe where we had agreed to meet, my hands shaking as I pushed open the door. The familiar scent of coffee and pastries filled the air, and I scanned the room, looking for him. There, by the window, sat Ryan. He looked as composed as ever, but there was something in his eyes, a weariness, a sadness, that made my heart ache. I walked over to him, and he looked up, his expression softening when he saw me. He stood up as I approached, his hands stuffed in his pockets. We didn't say anything right away. We just stood there, taking each other in, as though both of us were afraid that the moment would slip away if we spoke too soon. Finally, he cleared his throat. I'm glad you came, he said, his voice quieter than I remembered. I've been thinking about everything, about us. I've been thinking too, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Ryan, I'm sorry. I know I've said it before, but I really am. I never meant to hurt you. I messed up. He nodded slowly, his gaze never leaving mine. I know you didn't mean it like that. But it's not just about the words you said. It's about the way I've felt for a long time. Like I'm always second choice. Like you can't really see me for who I am, like I'm just a backup plan for you. The pain in his voice hit me like a physical blow. I wanted to reach out to him, to tell him how wrong he was, but the truth was, he had a point. I had always been too focused on what other people thought, too willing to bend to their expectations. And I had let that affect my relationship with him. I never saw you as a second choice, I said, my voice breaking. You were always the one I wanted. I didn't know how to show it. I didn't know how to let go of the expectations everyone else had for me. I was so afraid of not measuring up to their standards that I lost sight of what really mattered. What really mattered was you. It always has been. Ryan's expression softened, but there was still a distance between us that hadn't been there before. I know you care about me. But sometimes, caring isn't enough. You have to show it. And I think that's what's been missing all along. I don't need perfection, but I need someone who's willing to fight for me, to fight for us. I nodded, tears welling up in my eyes. I'll fight for us. I will. I just need you to give me a chance. I know I can do better. I know I can be the person you need. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. He just looked at me, as if weighing everything in his mind. I waited, holding my breath, praying that he would say something, anything, that would give me hope. And finally, he did. I think I'm ready to try, he said, his voice quiet but firm. But it's going to take time. You have to prove to me that you're really in this. That you're not just going to back off when things get tough. I felt a rush of relief, but at the same time, I knew this was just the beginning. It wasn't going to be easy. I couldn't expect him to forget everything just because I was saying the right things now. But I was willing to do the work. I was willing to show him, to show both of us, that I could be the person he deserved. I'm ready, I said, my voice steady now. I'll prove it. I promise. Ryan smiled, just the slightest curve of his lips, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. It wasn't going to be perfect. It wasn't going to be easy. But it was something. And that something was all I needed to start over. We sat down, finally facing each other, the space between us no longer filled with awkward tension. The conversation flowed more easily now, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like we were actually listening to each other, really hearing what the other person was saying. As the hours passed and the cafe began to empty, I knew that this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of something new. I had made mistakes, but now I had a chance to make things right. And I was going to take it. Ryan reached across the table and took my hand, his touch warm and reassuring. Let's take it one step at a time, he said. And I nodded, knowing that no matter what happened next, I was willing to take that step with him. Together.